Hi everyone, my name's Eleanor and I'm the Education Manager at Benjamin Franklin House. We are so delighted to be welcoming you to this, our first class in a new series all about early American history. And we're really grateful to the Robert H. Smith Foundation that have supported us so that we can start this new series. Lots of you may have joined before, but just in case you haven't, we are looking forward to your participation in the class today. I'm going to be asking you some questions and you may have questions for me. So you can either type in the chat, or if you press the raise hand button, then I can unmute your microphone and hear your voice over the audio. So this first class is all about pre-colonial America. This period is also sometimes referred to as pre-Columbian America. And next week, we're going to be thinking a bit about Christopher Columbus and when Europeans arrived on the continent. We're focusing on North America, although we will make some references to South America too. And in this wonderful illustration on the screen, this is actually a kind of European perspective of the Native American tribes that were living on the continent when they arrived. But before we get really stuck into the topic at hand, as always, we give a bit of background to who Benjamin Franklin was and also what he was doing in London, why there's a house named after him. I wonder if anyone joining us today would like to help me with that, like to tell us anything about Benjamin Franklin and what he was doing in London. You can see a raised hand. Hello.
Benjamin Franklin is one of the founding fathers of America, and he also is a scientist.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Yes, did you want to add something?
He is the father of electricity.
Yes, that's probably the science he's most famous for. Thanks, Zach and Louis. Okay, and I can see some comments in the chat. So Claire has very helpfully said that he was not only a founding father and a scientist, he was an inventor and a politician too. Thanks so much, everyone. So yes, here he is, Benjamin Franklin on the left of the screen. He first kind of made his fortune as a printer in America. He was born in Boston, then moved to Philadelphia, and then started working as a scientist. He, as we said, did a lot with electricity, invented the lightning rod to protect houses from lightning strikes, and then started taking on a political role. And that's really why he came to London to live in this house in 1757. It's on Craven Street, which is right in the centre of the city, around the corner from where Trafalgar Square is today. And he was trying to mend the relationship between Britain and America. He lived here for 16 years, but at the end of that time, it was becoming clear that that wasn't going to be possible. And so there was the War of Independence, where America broke away from Britain and became an independent country. So that's a bit of background to Benjamin Franklin and what he was doing in London. And we're doing this series about early American history because often people think straight away about the Revolution and the founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin, and we will come on to that period, but I think it's really important to understand what came before that as well. So let's find out more about that. And before I tell you more, I wonder what you know already. What do you know about America, particularly North America, before Europeans arrived? Do you know anything about who was living there, how they lived there? I see another raised hand. That's fantastic. Hi again.
It was the Native Americans who lived there.
Absolutely.
And I don't know that much actually.
Well, hopefully we'll learn lots in this class together. Thank you.
Actually, I think I do know one more.
Yeah.
No, I don't. I forgot.
No problem. I see a comment in the chat as well. And Claire has also said that Native Americans lived there. You're quite right. So let's have a look at a map of North America. Here we go. And so just like you said, there were lots of Native Americans living across North America, about 4 to 6 million, that's an estimate. And there were many more living in South America as well, but we're going to focus on North America today. And there were lots of different tribes And they had different ways of life, and these were their ways of life were really dependent on their environment, on the climate, and the resources that were available to them. So let's go through a few of these. So we can see the picture on the top right here. So in the Arctic areas, so we can see on the map that's sort of modern day Canada and Alaska, the state of Alaska as well. So you had the Inuit and Eskimo tribes living there, and they survived these icy conditions by hunting and fishing for animals like seals. And actually, because it was so cold, they needed to have a diet that was very fat heavy. So of course, seals have a lot of blubber, and so they were eating those to help them survive in these cold temperatures. And then you had the sort of northeastern parts around the Great Lakes. In this area, you had tribes such as the Haudenosaunee, and that tribes that have actually been called the Iroquois, but that's a European name. The original name is Haudenosaunee, and this term means people of the longhouse. We can see a picture of this on the top right, and we're going to be coming on in more detail to think about the different types of dwellings that Native Americans lived in. And they were really hunter-gatherers, so you can see some hunting has been going on here, but also gathering in terms of kind of farming. So maybe staying more put in one place and developing the land around them. Then you have the Great Plains and Great Basin area, and this was quite a dry landscape. And so the people that lived in these areas, so that was tribes such as the Wichita, they mostly moved around and followed the herds of bison or buffalo that were in that area. And so we can see their teepee dwellings here that they could move around with. Then in the east and the southeast, this was a much sort of greener, more fertile region. So these, the tribes that lived here, tribes such as the Cherokee, they really were, again, staying put and really developing the land and using some interesting agricultural techniques. On the northwest coast, there was a lot of fishing that went on in the Pacific Ocean as well. So hopefully you can see from that map and some of these images that the Native American way of life was very much in tune with the surroundings and the natural world around them. And we'll see that theme develop as we go through some different aspects of their customs and ways of life as well. So let's think a bit more about these different types of dwelling. So we had a look at the igloos. And as we said, they were in those really icy regions in modern day Canada and Alaska. And so igloos are basically made from packed blocks of snow and ice. And even though you might think that would be very cold, that actually makes a very good insulator. So they could get quite warm inside the igloos just from the body heat and the materials that were put inside them. So the igloos were good insulators against the really harsh winds and sub-zero temperatures you'd have in those areas. There'd normally be a kind of tunnel as an entrance. Again, that would help with insulation and keeping the warmth in the igloo. There would just be a few ventilation holes, but mainly they were trying to keep the warm inside. Okay, and then another type of dwelling which we've seen already, and you may have heard of before. In fact, in modern day times, often this design is copied, is teepees. And these were mostly used by those tribes in the Great Plains areas that were moving around a lot. We might call them kind of migratory or nomadic. And so teepees were handy because they could be put up and taken down quite quickly. So if they were moving on a lot to follow these herds of bison that they were hunting, then they could put the teepees up and down quite easily. And they're basically made from lots of wooden canes that are constructed together into a cone shape. And then you had animal hide stretched over these. So probably from the bison that they were hunting, and then you'd have more animal hide on the ground as well. And often it would be the women that would be in charge of putting up and taking down the teepees, as that kind of fell into the more domestic area of life as well. Now, another dwelling was wigwams. And these were in some way similar to teepees. They were made from branches, but also bark and other parts of the tree. But they were a bit more permanent. They provided better protection from the elements, from the wind and the rain, but they would have taken a bit longer to put up and take down. So the tribes that would have used wigwams might have been ones that were staying put more in one place, perhaps doing farming and more hunting and gathering in the same area. Likewise with grass houses. So these were mostly used in the southern part of the Great Plains. They're made out of a kind of thatched prairie grass, and there'd be a frame of wooden sticks underneath that the thatched grass would be put over. And because they were quite tightly plaited, they did provide quite good protection from the rain, but they wouldn't really keep the cold out. So that's why they were mostly in the southern part of the Great Plains, where it was warmer. Now, a really interesting type of dwelling, a very ancient type of dwelling, was pueblos. And these were even further south in the southwest, where it's a very dry and kind of desertous landscape. And so these were made often into a cliff. So the back wall would be the cliff. And then you had these kind of clay bricks made from a material called adobe, which is a mixture of mud and grasses. And so you would build these structures, and often they would be kind of replenished each year. There'd be a new layer of clay applied to make sure that they were still in good condition. And you usually would have just a few windows and openings, mostly at the top, and then you would climb ladders to actually enter into the structures. Now, in these very dry areas, once again, the communities, the tribes settled there would be more stationary, and they would construct these really complex irrigation systems. So they would channel using small dams the water, the little water that there was, so that they could farm in that area. Now, another interesting sort of structure was the earth mounds. These are found mostly in the southeast, so kind of around the Mississippi. And on top of the mounds, you'd have the most important community buildings. And then the mounds would be around a kind of big square or plaza where there'd be kind of social gatherings and important events. There was actually the largest kind of collection of dwellings, or city we could say, was Cahokia, which is near to modern day St. Louis. And there's a monk's mound there, which is about 100 feet tall. Then some other more permanent dwellings were longhouses. You would see these in the northeast, in the area we spoke of where the Haudenosaunee tribe lived, so that word meaning people of the longhouses. And this picture doesn't show it very well, but again, these could be, they would maybe only be about 20 feet across, but 100 feet long. And so you'd have lots of families living together in a longhouse. You can see the holes in the ceiling for smoke. I should have said that wigwams and teepees also had those holes to allow the smoke to escape. And these are more permanent as well. So they would be made from wooden planks, and they'd be bound together by these kind of curved planks of wood as well. And then you had plank houses that were really quite permanent, quite like wooden cabins. And you find these particularly in the northeastern part in those fishing communities, again, keeping put. So lots of different types of dwellings, and we're seeing how the Native Americans were using their local surroundings and the environment to determine how they lived and the types of dwellings that they used. So we spoke a bit about different ways to get food, and so it was mostly hunting and gathering. So the style of hunting would depend on the area that the tribes were living in. Of course, we spoke about in the Arctic and the northeastern regions, there being more fishing. On the Great Plains, it was mostly hunting of animals like deer and bison. And indeed, these families were moving around following the herds of animals. So they would use weapons for hunting, often with a kind of sharpened flint or a material like obsidian. So weapons might be things like arrows, also darts and spears too. So we can see in this picture arrows. And in terms of customs with hunting, it would vary from tribe to tribe, but there was often a lot of respect for the animals. There might be a prayer of thanks after an animal had been killed. And it wasn't customary for Native Americans to hunt for fun or for pleasure like we see in Europe, where hunting might be a kind of sport. It was very much to survive. And also Native American tribes would really make good use out of all of the animal. So for example, the ligaments and tendons might be used as a sort of thread when they're constructing those dwellings and using the hides. We spoke about how the hides would be used on the dwellings, also for clothing. So really making sure that they were getting all the use from the animals. Now, in terms of farming, there were some interesting techniques that we used. Again, this real respect for the land and working together with the land. So there was the slash and burn technique in agriculture. So by burning areas, this would help to kind of refertilize the land. And tribes would make sure that they didn't over-farm the land. If it was becoming kind of infertile, then they would move away to a new area. So even if they had those more permanent dwellings, if they needed to, they would move to a new area so as not to overuse the land. There was also this technique known as Three Sisters farming. So this was using 3 crops, which were corn, beans, and squash. And these 3 different crops kind of worked together and were mutually beneficial. So the corn would provide a kind of trellis that the beans could grow up, and then the squash would protect the roots of the corn. So they grew really well together, and having a diet of those things was very healthy as well. So as we mentioned, the farming was particularly on the eastern coast, and we'll be seeing next week how this was where a lot of the Europeans were arriving. So it was mostly those tribes that the Europeans were first interacting with when they arrived in North America. And then in terms of relationships between tribes, there would be kind of exchanges and bartering and trading. We can see represented here, trading fish for maize. So corn was a very important part of the diet of Native Americans. And so this was really useful. And again, it was kind of working together. So they would trade for things that they needed, that they didn't have. The materials like obsidian that I mentioned that were used for weapons were a particularly popular thing to trade, but also different types of food. And it would be an opportunity to build ties between different tribes and create relationships in that way as well. Now, thinking about connection to the land, another thing that was very interesting about Native American culture was their approach to medicine. So you can see an image on the left here, and it's showing all of the different kind of herbs and vegetables and fruits that were used by the Native Americans to cure common ailments. So some examples of these were rose hips. We can see a picture of these here. They're a kind of red-orange berry, and these were used to cure common colds and coughs, for example. Then rosemary actually was considered to be sacred by Native Americans, and this was used particularly to cure aching joints and other movement issues. And then blackberry tea was used by some tribes to treat upset stomachs as well. So once again, we see that real working together with the land and a great knowledge of the land around them as well. And then on the right, we can see what was termed a medicine man, or there might be medicine women as well, although they would be more connected with spirituality and spiritual healing. So another part of the land that was very important to the Native Americans was tobacco. And tobacco was used in kind of spiritual ceremonies where Native Americans were trying to make a connection with the Creator. And so there was something known as a pipe ceremony. And this might take place at the beginning of an event or a negotiation. And pipe smoke would not be inhaled, but be offered in different directions, for example, to the sky and to the earth, to give thanks for these different elements. So different parts of Native American culture. And then, as I mentioned, next week, we'll be thinking more about the conflicts between Native American tribes and the Europeans when they arrived. But there is evidence, both from archaeology and from oral history, that there was warfare between tribes before that, particularly in the kind of northeastern region. So there'd be conflicts over kind of territory. And also there's evidence that there was this practice of taking slaves from the enemy tribe, and this would be as a kind of recompense for any members of the tribe that had been lost. And then they might be tested physically, and if they were strong enough, they might be brought into the new tribe, or if they weren't strong enough, then they might be killed. And we've got some evidence of different types of weapons they might have used, so bows and arrows, knives, and also kind of stone clubs as well. So that's a bit of an overview to different aspects of the history of Native American culture. I wonder if you have any idea of how you think we know about this history. How do you think we've been able to learn about the Native Americans? I can see a raised hand. Hello.
By old writings, maybe, and also paintings.
Actually, Louis, I don't think it had writings. I think it would be archaeological digs.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point you raised. So you're quite right that the different ways that we know about Native American history, there wasn't writing wasn't a way that they recorded their important events. So some things that we know is kind of from the European records of when they arrived in North America, as you said, paintings, and also that oral history that was passed down from generation to generation, and then archaeology too. Thanks so much. Brilliant. So in these lessons, we will be not only learning the different facts of the history, but also thinking about those historical skills and how we can be good historians and learn about the past. And Claire has added about paintings and inscriptions in stone, but then also the archaeology side of things like bones and skeletons. And that's one of the ways that we've known that there were these wars between tribes from finding skeletons and what that's told us exactly. So I've got, we're coming towards the end of the class now, but I've got an activity to suggest you that you might like to try afterwards, thinking about those original sources that we have. So you mentioned paintings on caves or on the stone, and this is a wonderful piece of Native American art. It's at the Bears Ears National Monument. This is in the modern day state of Utah, and it's a procession. We can see different animals represented. So that's a very ancient monument, which is a kind of primary source that we have about Native American culture and traditions. And then on the right, this is a beautiful object from the National Museum of the American Indian. That's in Washington, D.C. And this was made more recently. This was made at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And this was from the sort of southwestern tribes, the Pueblos. And you can see all of these wonderful designs, we've got birds and different patterns. So my suggested activity is to research, have a look at some Native American art. It might be very ancient, like the ones we see on the left, or more recent, like we can see on the right, and have a go at kind of imitating some of those styles and creating some art of your own.